Today I'm going to present some results showing what's happened to the stream flow record over the last handful of decades. And in doing so, I'm going to present evidence that challenge two key assumptions that are fairly pervasive in hydrology. The first one is that when there's a drought or periods of low rainfall, the stream flow just sort of declines. The catchment doesn't particularly behave differently. The second one is that when that disturbance ends, such as a drought, the catchment comes back to how it was before. We're going to show some results that put some of this into question. The first assumption about how catchments behave during prolonged droughts draws very heavily from Margarita's work. She's not hiding, just bedding down. And what she was able to show is that there's a much larger reduction in the stream flow during long droughts than we would have expected, and also during short droughts. I'm going to demonstrate this concept a little bit, and we'll revisit it later. So if we had the annual stream flow, and we had a linearized annual precipitation on the x, and linearized annual stream flow on the y, we can plot them against each other. For 43% of catchments, she found that when you look at the whole historical record in blue and a dry period, let's say the Millennium Drought, catchment behaves the same. So for 1,000 millimeters rainfall, whether you're in a drought or non-drought, you get the same stream flow. So the catchment's behaving as we'd expect. But in 56% of catchments in southeastern Australia, she was able to show what happens is that during a prolonged drought, the catchment changes somehow or behaves differently. And so we get these red points that are shifted down from the long-term record. And so now, let's say for annual rainfall of 600 millimeters, you would normally get this stream flow. During prolonged droughts, you're producing a lot less runoff for the same amount of rainfall than standard hydrology would expect. And also, the change in rainfall is actually quite substantial. We're talking a 30 to 40% reduction in stream flow. So that's sort of the background to this work. So we've been looking in detail what's happening across Victoria. So with DELP support, we've been getting the highest quality stream flow records we can. So we've got 163 high quality stream flow gauges across Victoria that have no significant regulation, no major offtakes, few farm dams. We're looking at them in detail to try to understand how they've behaved during the Millennium Drought and how have they recovered in the years afterwards. Stream flow is very messy, so we've adopted two quite different approaches. One is drawing on the regression like linear equations that I showed, or scatter plots that I showed before. And that's looking at, if we just looked at let's say, the entire 10 years of the Millennium Drought, what's the dominant behaviour of the stream? Was the dominant behaviour that the stream switched, or did it stay in this normal state? Second is using hidden Markov models, where we're trying to understand actually when did the catchment start to behave in a different way and when did it recover. So not making any assumptions up front about when the Millennium Drought started and ended, or when the catchment and how the catchment responded. So I'm going to show you three typologies of response that we've observed. So up in the alpine area, but this behaviour was observed, where if we plot the pre-Millennium Drought stream flow and rainfall, drought in red and post-drought in green, and we fit regression relationships to each period, there's really no difference. So for 1,000 millimeters rainfall, you got the same stream flow whether you were before the Millennium Drought, during it, and after it. That's as we expected catchment. Move across to the Hopkins, things get a bit more interesting. So now we're out in the west. Well, during the Millennium Drought in blue, drought came along, runoff shifted down, so we're getting less runoff than we expected. Then the Millennium Drought ended, and the catchment came back to where it was before. So shifted, but has recovered. This is an interesting one. Out in the far east, Can River, very remote. What happened? Millennium drought came along. We shifted down to this red line, so less runoff per millimetre of rainfall. Millennium drought ended, and we haven't recovered. Catchment's behaving like it's still in the drought. So the three typologies, keep them in your head. I want to show you what's happening across the state spatially. Oh, sorry, jumping ahead of myself. So from this, using the first approach, we're able to conclude that 26% of Victoria's catchments we're able to study responded as we'd expected. 43% changed, but have now recovered. And 31% of that total have not recovered and are behaving like they're still in a drought. Let's have a look spatially. So these are the catchments we're able to study. If you've got good eyes, you'll see there's a catchment boundary and a little circle for where the gauge is. And what should be apparent here is that there's these broad trends where we can see generally the wetter alpine catchments were stable. They did not change during the millennium drought or after. And then as we move into the west, there was shift. There was shift and not recovered. But then this scattering of green catchments where the catchment changed and has come back. There is some broad sort of climatic relationships, it seems. Maybe coastal catchments change but do recover. Maybe the drier inland catchments are more vulnerable to not recovering, but open question. I'll show you what this looks like over time a little bit for one particular catchment. So I've got the rainfall anomalies on the top, and this is just how does the rainfall compare to the long-term average? Above, wetter, below, drier. So millennium drought came along, rainfall was predominantly below average. Drought broke, and we had some rainfall that was significantly above average. When we look at how the stream responded, we had a lot lower stream flow during the millennium drought. Drought ended, get a above average stream flow. Nothing that surprising there. But when we look at how the catchment behaved, based on those regression relationships, we see that even when the millennium drought ended, the catchment was still producing less stream flow than we would have expected. But then there seems to be this couple of year lag where in the subsequent 2 years we had a more stream flow than we would have expected just from that linear relationship. So that's where the second approach comes in. We're able to, that's the hidden Markov models, statistical approach again, where we can understand when changes happened, but it also allows us to include that serial correlation that seems to be apparent here and is fairly reasonable for any catchment that has any storage. So I'm going to present you what that looks like spatially. So here's the Can River again, and here's the observed stream flow in grey, so not transformed this time. And then what we're able to do is identify when the catchment was in a normal stream flow state and when it changed into a low stream flow state. So for this catchment, Can River, it happened in 2010, so fairly early on in the millennium drought. And just because the Markov models are all based on distributions, for every time point we get the median, and in this case I've just presented the 5th and 95th. So that's the range that the Markov model predicts for that time point. So what we can see in 2010, in 2000, the catchment switched into a low flow state. Millennium drought ended in 2010, and we've stayed in this low stream flow state. I'm going to show you what this looks like spatially over time. You can start to see how different catchments responded to the drought. So, 1990, we had to define a normal state, which we called 1990. You can argue with me later about that if you want. So, here's all the catchments. And there was, for every catchment we ran 68 different types of models and calibrated every one of them 20 times and chose the model that was most statistically significant. So some catchments could have had 3 states where they could have gone from low, normal, low, very low, or normal, high, very high. But they might have had 3 states, but they could have only had 1. So here, 1990, all the catchments were in their normal streamflow state. Jump to 2000. Good percentage of catchments have already switched into this low streamflow state. A few odd ones that behaved particularly, felt the brunt of it and had a very low streamflow state. Jump to the end of the Millennium Drought. And now we can see results that are reasonably consistent, but there are some anomalies down in the Hopkins area with the first map that I presented. But we can see large fraction of the drier catchments have changed, plus these sort of coastal ones. Okay. 2011, 2 years after the end. I'll just go back so you can see the switch. So quite a few in here switched back straight away, back to their normal flow state. Some of them, interestingly, came back to an even wetter behaviour. And then jump to the last year we're able to analyse, the 2016 water year, start of the year. And we can see that similarly to the first results, a good fraction of the catchments in the dry area, sort of dry areas of the state, are still behaving like they're in a drought. Showed you this plot before. We can do some things with it. Because we know what state the catchment's in, well, we've got a model that says we think we know, we can say, well, what state, or what would have been the stream flow for that given year if the catchment was in its normal flow sort of behaviour? That's what it's not as clear as I would have hoped, but we can see these dashed lines with the green circle is the stream flow we would have had if the catchment was behaving normally. And so what we can say is, well, we can take the median of that normal flow and look at the difference to what actually occurred. And that's the flow that, for some reason, wasn't appearing in the streams. Interestingly, it's the wetter years that have the greatest impact. Dry years is quite a modest impact. So this is what it looks like spatially. Whoop, sorry, sloppy typo. There was a few catchments where the analysis has defeated me, so watch this space. But what we can see is, well, these the alpine catchments that I said before didn't change state, so they had no change in, that were 0 change in the median streamflow. But many catchments here in this sort of aqua to green range of 15 to 26 millimetres per annum less streamflow. A few, we're talking 50, 90 millimetres per annum. So that's during the drought. After the drought, things get worse. That's because streamflow went up. It's because rainfall went up, but the streamflow didn't come up with it. And so we can see there's quite a number of catchments here where now the lowest state is now at 50 millimetres less per annum less streamflow, and there's many that are sort of more in the 70s to 100s. I'd like to show you this also. It's like what's happening over time when we just look at the number of catchments that are in a normal or wetter state versus low or very low state. So in 1990, that was our normal, so we had 0 catchments in a less than normal flow state. 1995, and interestingly, some catchments started changing quite early into a low flow state. And then there was this just general sort of arcing, rising trend. Millennium Drought ended. Some 25–30% of catchments recovered straight away. So it's reasonable to assume that those catchments would be more resilient to this climate variability. What we find very interesting is that in the years afterwards, the number of catchments in this low flow state is about constant. If you went by a lot of standard hydrology, you would say, oh well, everything's just filling up, and eventually we'll get these catchments will recover. If you went by that sort of mindset, I think it's reasonable to expect that as the catchments filled, this percentage of catchments would be sort of decaying down. But we don't see any of that. It seems to be fixed at this 30-something percent catchments. So yes, bit of a mystery. So just some general findings. There is long-term memory in the catchment response, and that does complicate things. Nothing that's surprising there. But there's a variety of ways the catchments respond and recover to drought. There seems to be very complex spatial patterns where there is a bit of an overlay of climate, but much more complex local things seem to be going on. And as mentioned before, about 1/3 of catchments have not recovered. So the percentage of rainfall to stream flow is like we're still in a drought at these 1/3 of catchments. Current work is that we're trying to examine this not on an annual time step, but on a seasonal time step or biannual, to understand if it's simply just driven by a change, for example, in the wet season rainfall. We're trying to understand how these patterns are observing linked to catchment attributes, trying to get some explanations of them, and then look to see what's happening spatially. So, for example, do you have the first catchment at the top change and that propagates down, or do they all change at once? And we've also got a linkage grant with Melbourne Water and DELT that will be tackling issues about how, or some of the drivers of this. So, couldn't have done it without FICWACI. And if you're interested, one of the public outputs is a little app we've developed called AWAPA that allows you to extract catchment weighted data for anywhere in the country very easily.